September 11th, 2025. A day that will be remembered not for tragedy, but for an unexpected miracle. While Washington, Paris, and Brussels failed again to bring peace to the Middle East, a young African soldier turned president did what the world thought was impossible. Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso, only 37 years old, brought Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas to the same table in Amman, Jordan. And against all odds, they signed a ceasefire that has held for 4 months, the longest period of sustained peace in the region in more than a decade. Picture this moment. In Gaza, children played in the streets without the roar of jets above. In Tel Aviv, families gathered for Sabbath without fear of rocket alarms. At the same hour, in Burkina Faso's capital, Ouagadougou, church bells and mosque calls echoed together. For a brief and powerful moment, hope sounded louder than war. This was not American power. It was not European diplomacy. It was African leadership, raw, unpolished, and born from the soil of suffering. Captain Ibrahim Traoré did not enter politics through think tanks or photo ops in Paris. He came from the battlefield, from villages where terrorists burned schools and where mothers buried their sons. He knew pain, and he carried that pain to the negotiating table. And so the world asks, how could a leader from one of the poorest nations achieve what the world's richest and most powerful could not? Is this the beginning of a new global order where Africa writes the script for peace? Or will the same forces that destroyed Thomas Sankara and Muammar Gaddafi now target Traoré? Brothers and sisters, stay with us. What you are about to hear will change how you see Africa, how you see diplomacy, and perhaps how you see the world itself. Before we begin, I invite you to reflect. If peace can come not from Washington or Paris but from Ouagadougou, what does that tell us about where true wisdom resides? On May 15, 2025, the world received a message from Ouagadougou that sounded almost unreal. Standing in his simple uniform, without the luxury of golden podiums or marble halls, President Ibrahim Traoré declared that Burkina Faso would host Middle East peace negotiations. His words echoed across Africa and beyond. The Middle East has suffered for decades. The most powerful nations have failed to bring peace. It is time for Africa to show the world what true leadership looks like. We who have suffered from foreign interference and colonial violence understand both the pain of the oppressed and the fear of the besieged. The announcement landed like thunder. In Tel Aviv, the Israeli Foreign Ministry dismissed it as naive African posturing. In Ramallah, the Palestinian Authority cautiously welcomed the idea, saying, "If it is serious, we are ready." In Washington, the State Department warned against unauthorized diplomatic interventions. And in Brussels, European diplomats shook their heads, doubting Africa's capacity for high-stakes mediation. But Traoré was not posturing. He had a plan, one that combined Africa's moral authority, his own credibility as a soldier who fought terrorism, and the backing of powerful partners. Intelligence sources later revealed the depth of this strategy. Russia and China quietly signaled their willingness to provide diplomatic cover. Burkina Faso's control of gold and uranium meant leverage. Most importantly, Traoré knew the Middle East did not need another lecture from the West. It needed a fresh perspective, free from colonial baggage and imperial ambitions. At the University of Ouagadougou, Dr. Amara Sankara explained it this way. Traoré understood that the Middle East needed healing, not deals. He carried no history of crusades or colonial mandates. His only history was the suffering of his own people. That gave him a unique legitimacy. For 2 tense weeks, secret channels buzzed with negotiation. Then came the impossible breakthrough. On May 29, 2025, both Israeli and Palestinian delegations agreed to preliminary talks in Amman, Jordan. It stunned even the skeptics. The terms were clear. The African Union would serve as neutral moderator. There would be no preconditions for discussion. The focus would be on an immediate humanitarian ceasefire, and international guarantees would come from Russia and China. On June 2nd, the talks began. The venue was heavily fortified, guarded by Jordanian troops and watched closely by satellites from every corner of the globe. For 15 days, Traore worked as both soldier and storyteller. His approach was unlike anything diplomats had seen before. The first 3 days were dedicated to personal storytelling. Traore began with his own testimony. He told of villages in northern Burkina Faso where children were slaughtered by terrorists, where fathers buried daughters, and where the world's powerful nations offered sympathy but not safety. His voice did not tremble. He looked directly at the Israelis and Palestinians and said, "This pain knows no nationality, no religion, no politics." Palestinian mothers' tears taste the same as Israeli mothers' tears. The blood of your children is the same red as the blood of my people. On days 4 through 7, he held joint sessions. Both sides were allowed to share their traumas without interruption. For the first time in years, Palestinian officials spoke of Nakba without being cut off. Israeli officials spoke of rockets and suicide bombings without mockery. Traore insisted on silence and listening. It was the African way, the palaver tradition. Let every voice be heard until the room itself becomes the judge. On days 8 through 12, the focus shifted to practical solutions: food corridors, prisoner exchanges, humanitarian aid, and monitoring systems. Traore refused to allow ideological debates. "We are not here to solve 1948, he said. "We are here to stop the bleeding today." Finally, on days 13 through 15, the last obstacles fell. On June 15, 2025, the Amman Accords were signed. The terms were simple but powerful: a 14-day ceasefire in Gaza and the West Bank, humanitarian corridors supervised by African Union peacekeepers, prisoner exchanges facilitated by African mediators, and international monitoring by Russia, China, and the African Union. The world was stunned. The impossible had happened. For the first time in more than 10 years, Israel and Palestine agreed to stop the killing. And it was not because of American pressure or European promises. It was because of an African soldier who spoke from the heart, who carried scars instead of statistics, and who demanded that both sides see their humanity reflected in one another. The signing of the Amman Accords on June 15, 2025 was a historic breakthrough. But peace, especially when it comes from unexpected places, always has enemies. Just 5 days later, Western intelligence agencies launched what leaked documents later called Operation Desert Storm. The goal was not to stop terrorism or stabilize the region. The goal was to sabotage an African-led peace initiative that threatened the monopoly of Western diplomacy. According to classified reports exposed by whistleblowers, the CIA allocated $23 million for disinformation campaigns portraying Traore as an Iranian proxy. French intelligence, the DGSE, committed €18 million to pressure African countries to distance themselves from his efforts. British MI6 dedicated £12 million to investigate African funding sources and to sow doubts in the European Parliament. Media manipulation intensified. Western outlets began asking whether an African soldier had the capacity to mediate serious conflicts. In Paris and London, the narrative was clear. This was overreach, and it must fail. But words soon gave way to violence. On June 25, 2025, President Traore's convoy was ambushed in Tel Aviv. Unidentified snipers opened fire with high-precision rifles, later traced to Western military suppliers. The attack killed Lieutenant Kabore, Traore's trusted aide, and wounded Traore in the shoulder. The convoy route, investigators later confirmed, had been known only to a handful of Western intelligence partners. It was no coincidence. It was a message. Peace would be punished. In Ouagadougou, news of the attack spread like wildfire. The image of Traore, his arm bandaged, standing before cameras just hours later, became iconic. His words cut through the air like a blade. "They killed my friend to stop peace. His blood will not be wasted. The ceasefire will hold." And hold it did. Instead of collapsing, the Amman Accords grew stronger. International sympathy poured in. Palestinian leaders condemned the attack. Israeli officials, too, expressed outrage that a mediator had been targeted. The African Union called an emergency session, declaring unanimous support for Traore's mission. Russia and China increased security for African peace delegations. What was meant to silence him, instead elevated him. Across Africa, people took to the streets. In Ouagadougou alone, more than 2.3 million filled the avenues to welcome Traore home in July. They waved Palestinian and Israeli flags alongside Burkina Faso's colors. They chanted in French, in Arabic, in English. "Africa the peacemaker." International reactions came quickly. South Africa's president, Cyril Ramaphosa, declared, "Captain Traore has restored Africa's place at the global table. We are no longer beggars for Western solutions. We are providers of African wisdom." Kenya's former president, Uhuru Kenyatta, echoed him. "This young man has shown that Africa can solve the world's problems when we are given the chance and the respect we deserve." And from the African Union, Commission Chairperson Musa Faki Mahamat proclaimed, "The Amman Accords represent the dawn of African diplomatic leadership." But it wasn't just Africa. Global recognition began to flow. 147 international scholars nominated Traore for the Nobel Peace Prize. The Secretary-General of the United Nations praised Burkina Faso's diplomatic innovation. Even the Vatican extended a private invitation, with Pope Francis requesting an audience with the African soldier who had given peace a chance. Academics and diplomats began speaking of a new model, the Traore method. It was simple, yet revolutionary. African cultural wisdom adapted to international diplomacy. Ubuntu philosophy, which teaches "I am because we are," emphasized shared humanity over political differences. The palaver tradition gave each side space to speak fully, restoring dignity to dialogue. And ancestral wisdom placed healing above victory, community above ideology. As Dr. Fatou Traore, a conflict psychologist at the University of Ouagadougou, explained, Western diplomacy focuses on interests and leverage. African diplomacy focuses on relationships and healing. President Traore understood that Israelis and Palestinians needed emotional healing before political solutions. And the results spoke for themselves. By September 2025, the ceasefire had held for 4 months, longer than any in recent memory. Humanitarian aid was flowing. Schools in Gaza were being rebuilt with African technical assistance. Israeli and Palestinian farmers were cooperating on agricultural projects. And most importantly, civilian deaths had dropped to 0. Yet even as hope grew, the threats remained. Western powers were unsettled, perhaps even afraid. For decades, they had claimed a monopoly on peace processes. Now a soldier from Burkina Faso had rewritten the rules. Brothers and sisters, pause here and consider. If Western powers fear African peace so much that they would rather risk assassination than recognition, what does that tell us about who truly wants war and who truly wants peace? By July 2025, the ceasefire born from the Amman Accords was no longer just an agreement on paper. It was a lived reality in the streets of Gaza and Tel Aviv. For the first time in more than a decade, children in Gaza could walk to school without fear of drones above. For the first time in years, Israeli families sat together on Friday nights without running to bomb shelters. It was fragile, yes, but it was real. 4 months of peace. 4 months without civilian bloodshed. The humanitarian corridors, supervised by African Union peacekeepers, became lifelines. Trucks carrying food, medicine, and supplies rolled through checkpoints where before there had only been tanks and barbed wire. African medics assisted in evacuating the wounded to neutral hospitals. In Gaza, African engineers helped rebuild schools using low-cost, rapid construction methods pioneered in the Sahel. In small but powerful ways, Africa's hands were healing wounds thousands of miles away. And it wasn't just about survival. Symbolic cooperation began to bloom. Israeli and Palestinian farmers launched joint agricultural projects with technical advice from Burkina experts who understood farming under harsh climates. Olive trees, a symbol of resilience, were planted by both communities on shared land. Small steps, but each one a seed of trust. The political consequences were just as dramatic. Across Africa, the image of Traore returning home to Ouagadougou with his arm still bandaged, standing before a crowd of over 2 million, sent shockwaves through a continent long told it was incapable of leading. Young people in Dakar, Nairobi, Lagos, and Kinshasa painted murals of him. The slogan, "Africa the Peacemaker," trended on social media in multiple languages. For many, this was not just about the Middle East. It was about Africa reclaiming dignity on the world stage. Inside Burkina Faso, the effect was electric. Universities held forums on African diplomacy. Women's groups organized supply drives for Gaza. Student volunteers signed up to join future African peace missions. What the West had mocked as naive posturing had become a national point of pride, a source of unity in a country often torn by hardship. But pride was mixed with danger. Analysts warned that Burkina Faso could become a target of destabilization, just as Libya had been after Gaddafi's bold moves. Memories of Thomas Sankara's assassination in 1987 haunted older generations. Yet the people were not afraid. If they hated him this much, young activists joked, he must be doing something right. The ripple effect extended beyond Africa. The ceasefire's success created new demand for African mediation. Ukraine's leaders sent quiet signals requesting African involvement in their talks with Russia. Ethiopia and Eritrea asked for Burkina guidance in border disputes. Chad and Sudan sought African Union support in their fragile negotiations. In a matter of months, Africa shifted from being seen as a battleground for conflicts to being recognized as a broker of peace. This shift terrified Western elites. For decades, the model was simple. Western powers acted as mediators, while African nations were recipients of aid and subjects of lectures. Now, the roles were reversed. Traore was showing that Africa could not only solve its own problems, but also offer solutions to the world's most intractable conflicts. At the heart of this transformation was a simple truth. Traore did not treat peace as a business deal. He treated it as a human necessity. His credibility came not from wealth or weapons, but from wounds, and the world could not ignore it. But let us pause here. Brothers and sisters, think of this moment. If 4 months of peace could be achieved by one African soldier who refused to kneel, what could be achieved if an entire continent rose together? The consequences were not only diplomatic, they were spiritual. Across Africa, church leaders and imams framed Traore's mission as a calling from God, a testimony that peace belongs to the humble, not the powerful. In villages and cities, prayers for Gaza and Israel were joined with prayers for Burkina Faso's safety. The struggle was no longer theirs alone. It was ours. And so, a question began to spread. Was Ibrahim Traoré just a national leader, or was he becoming a symbol of something larger? A voice for the oppressed of every land, a reminder that true power comes not from empire, but from the courage to say no. While African streets filled with celebrations, the corridors of Washington, Paris, and London were far less joyful. For the United States, Traore's success created a diplomatic dilemma. For decades, American administrations had positioned themselves as indispensable in Middle East peace talks. Now, an African soldier, without think tanks, without billion-dollar aid packages, without military bases, had done what Washington could not. Officially, the State Department offered cautious words of support. Behind closed doors, however, leaked documents painted a different picture. Operation Desert Storm had not been a rogue idea. It reflected deep anxiety that African-led peace could weaken Western influence in the region. If Ouagadougou becomes a diplomatic hub, one memo warned, Western leverage in the Middle East will erode significantly. In Europe, skepticism turned to embarrassment. The European Union had mocked the idea of African mediation. Now, European leaders scrambled to adjust. France quietly offered to partner in African peace initiatives. The United Kingdom requested coordination on conflict resolution. Germany announced funding for African diplomatic training programs. None of these moves were born from goodwill. They were survival tactics in a world shifting beneath their feet. Russia and China, on the other hand, embraced the change. Moscow provided additional security for African mediators. Beijing announced a multi-million-dollar investment in a new African Peace Institute in Ouagadougou. Both powers saw Traore's breakthrough as a chance to accelerate a multipolar world order where Africa was not a pawn, but a player. Other nations soon joined in. Iran publicly recognized African diplomatic authority, praising Traore's moral courage. Turkey expressed support for African mediation efforts. Even nations far removed from the conflict, Brazil, India, Indonesia, pointed to the Amman Accords as proof that the Global South could lead where the Global North had failed. But the most telling reaction came not from governments, but from ordinary people. Across the Middle East, citizens spoke of Traore with a respect rarely shown to outside leaders. In Israel, a mother whose son had survived the latest war told journalists, "He listened to our pain. He respected our fear. No one else did." In Palestine, a father rebuilding his home said simply, "For the first time, I believe peace is possible." Brothers and sisters, consider this. When ordinary people trust a foreign leader more than their own politicians, is that not the sign of true legitimacy? Brothers and sisters, the Amman Accords were more than just a ceasefire. They were proof that the world does not have to accept endless war. For 4 months, Israelis and Palestinians lived without daily fear. For 4 months, Africa showed the world that peace could come from the margins, not the empires. But with triumph came danger. The assassination attempt on June 25th was a warning. Just as Thomas Sankara was cut down, just as Muammar Gaddafi was toppled, forces threatened by African independence will not rest. Traore knows this. He has said openly, "They will try to destroy me, but peace will not die." The question is whether the world will stand with him, or whether history will repeat itself. Will Traore become the Mandela of our time, leading a renaissance of African diplomacy? Or will he share the fate of leaders who dared to defy the powers that profit from war? The consequences extend far beyond the Middle East, in Ukraine, in Sudan, in Ethiopia, in Myanmar. Conflicts rage with no end in sight. If Africa can heal the Holy Land, can it also heal these wounds? And if it can, will the West allow it? This is not just about one man. It is about whether humanity will accept new voices in global leadership. For centuries, Africa was told it had nothing to offer but resources and labor. Now it offers wisdom, courage, and moral authority. That is why Traore is dangerous to the powerful, because he proves that Africa does not need permission to lead. Brothers and sisters, I ask you to reflect deeply. What does it mean that a soldier from one of the poorest countries on earth has achieved what the richest nations failed to deliver? What does it say about the true nature of power, of justice, of peace? If you believe Africa deserves recognition as a global peacemaker, share this story with your friends and family. If you believe peace belongs not to the powerful, but to the courageous, speak it in your heart tonight. And if you believe the blood of Lieutenant Traore and the courage of Ibrahim Traoré must not be forgotten, write in the comments, Africa the peacemaker. The Middle East is quiet. Africa is rising. The world is watching. The future, brothers and sisters, may very well be African.